Hi guys, we are installing a dual rate spring kit for a Polaris RZR XP1000. Here's the stock tender and stock main that we're going to remove. You'll reuse your lower retainer and guard and spring divider, and then provided is the new tender spring and main spring that are specific to the weight of the vehicle. This is a 4-seater, like I said. And you also get your crossover nut that goes inside your tender spring. And this is really what makes the magic happen, because you're able to tune your crossover point. So it's a great kit. Check it out, zbrozracing.com. Alright, so when you're installing this dual rate kit, one of the first things you're going to want to do is get the car up in the air, whether you jack the back end up or the front end up. We've got it on a lift here, but you're going to want to undo your shock so that it's loose and hanging, and then back off your preload nut, which is up here on top. And what works really good on this Walker Evans shock is just a 1/4 inch punch. It'll actually fit right into the holes there, so that once it gets loose enough, you'll be able to spin it by hand. But depending on how much preload you've had to jack in there in order to try to make this setup work, a 1/4 inch punch works really well. So once you do that, you're able to pull everything right off. So you're going to reuse your guard and your lower retainer. So hang on to those. Slide the pack right off without even undoing the top bolt. So I might want to note that. You can leave the top bolt done up. Then you're going to get rid of your tender, that's the weak link, and also the stock main. And you're going to retain this divider. So we're going to reuse this on the dual rate spring kit that you're going to install. So this spring kit's actually been painted for this customer. So all of our spring kits come black. He custom powder coated this to match his the turbo orange that's on this 4-seater. So that's not common. The other part that's going to be in the kit that you need to know how to do is this crossover nut. So, and in the instructions it'll tell you where to position that, but there's 2 little Allen bolts on each side. You have to take these 4 bolts out, and then you can separate the 2 halves and then put them right back on. Alright, so I've got my Allen wrench and I've got the crossover nut here in 2 pieces. One thing that you want to pay attention to is make sure you get this straight on the threads, because it'll go on at a slight angle to where you're off a 1/2 thread. And the way you can tell that it's straight is the holes are going to line up better on the front and the back, and it'll spin nicely. And also when you tighten down, it's kind of hard to see right there, but you can see it's still spin right there, but it's not lined up perfectly. So, and you may have to flip 1/2 over to get it to go on there nice and smooth, and it should spin easily with just a little bit of tension on these screws. I usually just put 1 in on each side and then spin it to the distance that you need it, or in the ballpark anyway. And then we'll go over, after I put the springs on, how to set up this crossover position and how to measure it. So the instructions go over that, of course, so take the time to read through the instructions. It'll really help so that you understand what you're doing. But that's one thing we get all the time, phone calls saying that they've got the wrong crossover nut. In fact, it's just, off a 1/2 thread or something like that. So once you get it lined up, and I haven't tightened down these little set screws, they're just snug. And when it's like that, as you can see, I don't know if you can see in the video, but you can just spin it up or down to the position you need it to. So it should move fairly easily. So once you get that on, next step's going to be to grab your tender spring, which is the smallest of the springs in the package, with a 3-inch ID. So it's 10 inches long. This is a 4-seater, so it's a little bit different rate than on the 2. Okay, so after you get your preload nut on, just spin it up there a little ways and then put your tender on. Then you're going to reuse your spring divider. So it's going to go with the long lip down, facing down. Slide that on. Grab your main. As I mentioned, these are powder coated, custom to match this orange. Slide that all the way up. Then you're going to want to put your stock retainer on first. Kind of drops down into its little slot. Then you can put the guard back on like that. Drop everything in until it seats. And at that point you can actually hook it back up to your trailing arm. Put your bolt back in at this point. Make sure your guard is centered up. You're basically back together. Now you're going to go through your, as the instructions show you, they'll tell you how many turns of preload to put in. So essentially you want to turn your preload nut down until it touches. So right now I have about an 1/8 inch gap. So you just keep turning until that gap's gone. And essentially the springs are now no longer loose. So that's your minimum amount of preload that you can have. So that's what we consider zero preload, is I guess the shop term. So right now you have zero preload, and I think in the instructions it says start with 1/4 inch to 3/8 inch, which is about 4 turns, where this is a 4-seater, and I know this customer has kids and he usually has 4 people in the car, so the car is going to be heavier most of the time, and he is putting a box in the back that has a rack on the top of it. I'm probably going to put probably 5 or 6 turns of preload, so I'll just count my revolutions. And you can take a Sharpie and put a mark or an X and then simply just count your revolutions. And then once you get your turns of preload in, that's when you're going to set your crossover distance. And I'm going to stop this and I'm going to get the camera a little bit closer so I can show you where you measure to set your crossover distance. Okay, it's going to be kind of hard to see, but I've got it as close as I can. So we give you a travel distance for the crossover. So with the spring combination that we have, you want to measure from the bottom of the crossover nut to the top of your spring divider. So there's a little lip that comes up inside the tender spring. It's probably going to be hard to see, but it's down inside there. That's the contact point that's going to run into this crossover nut. So you're trying to measure from the crossover nut down to the edge of that lip, and you can just use a measuring tape and sight across and just get that measurement. For this particular setup, we're just going to set him at about 4 3/4 inch because he's putting one of our adjustable sway bars on too, so he's not going to need maybe as much crossover. So you just set that, let's say 4.750 or 4 inches, 4 3/4 inches from the bottom of the crossover. So essentially that's your contact point or your travel. So they're going to work as a combination together until it gets to that point, and then at that point you're going to be on your mainspring, and that's what makes it a tunable dual rate. And by moving this nut closer to the main or down, and we usually recommend 2, maybe 3 turn revolution changes, by moving it down you're going to only affect your bottoming resistance. So it's essentially tuning it for just really big bumps or landings, and then your preload you can utilize to set your ride height. So in a nutshell, preload is what will set your ride height, and crossover is going to affect more of your bottoming resistance, large bumps. It can, depending on at what percentage it's coming in at, you can use the crossover to tune your roll stability, but that's really what the sway bar is for. So just follow the directions, but that's how you measure it. You're just going to hold it an eye across to that black spot where it's going to hit, and you're going to set it at 4 3/4. That's a really good starting point, and then from there you can go out there and ride it, and if you find that it is bottoming out, then you can move it down closer. All right, I forgot to mention one thing. You want to set your preload first. So set your preload setting before you set your crossover, because as you adjust preload, it's going to change this crossover point. So once you get your preload set, now that I've set it, I put his at about 5 turns. Then I can set this at the 4 3/4 inch, which essentially that's where I'm at right now. And then you can tighten up your little set screws. And if you hold this top preload ring, you can twist on the spring and kind of line it up so you can get into that crossover nut. Sometimes the spring's in the way of getting your Allen wrench in there to tighten it down, but if you just hold on there, you can freely twist these springs All right, so we went over the rear, now we're moving on to the front. So I've already got the car up in the air. Loosen the preload all the way off and remove the retainer. This is going to be replaced, so you can set that to the side. Pull the spring pack off, and you're going to replace both springs. And then most of the kits do come with a new divider that's already been cut, but the instructions talks about if you are reusing your divider, you need to cut that lip down. Show you here. So this one's been cut down. It's essentially 3/4 of an inch because this is now going to be your crossover point. So new tender, it's progressive tender. One thing I do want to note is just put them on the same way. So you see there's tight coils and wider coils there. Just make sure they match right to left. They don't actually have to go a particular way, but long lip goes up inside now, so opposite of how stock is, because this is going to be your crossover point. So that's what's going to cross over or bottom out on your preload nut. So slide your tender on, slide your main on. The new retainer, it's just going to go just like that, so it seats in there and it can't come off. And then drop the spring in. Spin your preload nut back down to 0 preload. We talked about it on the rear. 0 preload means that there's no slot here. So right now we have about 1/4 of an inch that we need to go. So you're going to turn that down until it stops. Once it touches, now we're at 0, and we're going to set this one up because it's a 4-seater. Just going to follow the instructions. So 2 to 4 turns is usually a good starting point. As you add preload, you're going to raise the ride height. You're also going to make it cross over sooner because you're going to force this crossover point to happen sooner. So we're just going to set this one up just like the instructions say. And because he does a lot of rock crawling and trail riding, we're going to remove the front sway bar. You can go either way. I prefer this kit on 2-seaters and 4-seaters without the sway bar in because of how we're changing the way that this spring package works with the dual rate. You're able to run without the sway bar and get still a very comfortable ride that doesn't have a whole bunch of body roll. We talked a little bit about this car. He actually has our adjustable sway bar, so he can tune how much flex and sway he wants with our sway bar. So we're going to remove his front sway bar and just set the preload just like the instructions say. So read through the instructions and follow those, and go to zbrozracing.com for all of your UTV suspension needs. Okay, really quick, I just wanted to talk a little bit about our replacement sway bar, which is adjustable. It's pretty easy to install, but I've already got the stock one removed. It's essentially 4 bolts, 2 on this side, 2 on the passenger side, and then some bars, Polaris has 2 different diameter bars, so because this is a newer machine, it has the smaller bar diameter, so we replaced the bushings. It's part of the sway bar kit, so it actually will come with the new bushings. If you're pre-2016 or non-turbo, the stock bushings will work with our bar. So I've already got the actual bar itself installed, but the beauty of this bar is it's an actual torsion bar. So it's going to come with this side arm, as we call it, which is adjustable. And I don't know if you can see it or not, but you've got 7 different hole positions. And the instructions talk about what each hole does. But you're able to basically set the car up for short course or desert or sand dunes by having a stiffer sway bar position, or for rock crawling and more low speed stuff, or all around type riding. The bar is going to give you more plushness right off the bat, and you can buy the bar on its own or with the high strength link rods. So the stock rods, as you can see, they're just a teeny tiny wire rod, and they tend to bend quite a bit, especially when you go to a stiffer bar or one that's adjustable like this. Our bar isn't necessarily stiffer, but it has the option of going stiffer depending on where you mount it here. So to install it, like I said, it's 4 bolts, and then there's a slot on the end of the bar with a clip in it, and all you have to do is line up this arm, slide it on. There's a bolt right here you have to tighten down, 13mm end wrench, and then this pin is just so that even if that ever does come loose, there's no way that this arm can come off. And once the arm's on there, you're going to reuse your stock bolts and put the desired link rod color that it shows right back into the stock location. And this is nice because it's adjustable. So this one I've got loose here so I can show you. So you can actually load one side of the car. So depending on what type of racing you're doing for short course, you might find that where you don't have a passenger and the car's a little bit unbalanced, you want to add some load to the one side of the car. You can use this to lengthen it while it's installed to add some load to the bar to help the car to stay level in the corner because you have extra weight on the driver's side. So that's our sway bar. It's the most adjustable in the industry. It's an axial torsion bar, so it's made to flex. It gives the car a lot better ride quality, especially on the small bumps, and gives you that tunability for rock crawling and more like King of Hammers type terrain where you're doing desert and rock crawling. You can get the best of both worlds with our bar. So, all right, now that you got your spring kit installed, just want to go over a couple of the tuning things that you need to know. First off, remember preload, your top nut up here, that's going to affect your ride height and ground clearance, you know, so if you're looking for a higher ride height, you're going to want to add preload. And then inside the tender spring on the rear, you've got these crossover nuts. And again, the closer you move that nut to the mainspring, the more bottoming resistance and better roll control that you're going to have. It'll also help to resist bottoming on the big jumps and hard hits. So again, preload is your ride height and crossover is going to be your bottoming resistance. All right, now we're moving up to the front. Spring kit's installed. So you got your new tender spring, your new mainspring. You've flipped the spring divider and you've cut it down or used the divider that's supplied. And up front it's a little bit simpler because it's a fixed crossover. The two adjustments that you have are your clicker adjustment, which is for fine tuning, and then your preload. So your preload nut, as you add preload, it'll raise your ride height and make the ride stiffer at the same time because it'll force the crossover point to happen sooner. So if you want more ride height or more bottoming resistance on the front end, you want to play with your preload, and then you can utilize your clicker, your factory clicker on this shock to fine tune for different changing conditions.